Welcome to the Economic and Political History Podcast, where we discuss the latest ideas on the intersection of economics, political science, and history. Hi, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Economic and Political History Podcast. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. And today I'm thrilled to be joined by Walter Scheidel. Walter is the Dickinson Professor in the Humanities and a Professor of Classics and History at Stanford. And he's the author of What is Ancient History? A book that was recently published by Princeton University Press. Walter, how are you?
Good. It's good. Thanks for having me on your podcast.
No, thanks for taking the time. And before getting into the book, I'd like to start with this general question about your origins. I want to hear about how you ended up being the type of scholar that you are, this very general, global oriented historian. And I'm particularly curious about your transition from the European Academy to the US, right? So I want to hear that story. I also want to hear more, and I'm packing here a bunch of my personal curiosities about your arrival to Stanford and the formation of this thing that some people call the Stanford School, the Stanford turn in the economic history of the ancient world. I've heard that Ian Morris played a role in you coming here. I want to hear those stories, so please tell me about it.
Okay, well, it's been quite a transition. There are lots of stories to tell, but it would fill the whole hour. So I guess I have to be more economical about this. In terms of origins, well, I grew up in Vienna in Austria and spent the first 28 years of my life there. I was always interested in antiquity. I have no idea why, because there was no family background. But when I was 8 or 9, I was already into Greeks and Romans, and not just Greeks and Romans, I would say Assyrians and Persians, and any number of other ancient societies. And then, I made the mistake. Everybody told me it was a mistake to go to university and study this. And in a way, it was a mistake because I spent 10 years there. And I discovered that people who studied the ancient world there were really very much preoccupied with what particular bodies of evidence would tell them. So, study was essentially driven by what was out there. And the hope was that questions would arise from just looking at the material, which I found always very dissatisfying because I wasn't really interested in grand literature and high art and big ideas and those kinds of things. I was interested in how things really worked, what we might call social economic history. And nobody did that. So I spent all my time in the library and I read books written by people in Cambridge in particular. They had a Cambridge school. It was a real school, unlike the Stanford school, a cluster of people over a couple generations who really tried to look at Greco-Roman social economic history through, comparative approaches and bringing in social science work and any number of things. And I found this really, really interesting. So I was sort of on my own, but I always wanted to be part of it. So when I left after my PhD, I had a postdoc in Cambridge for 4 years, and I got to meet all the people who were still alive at the time and worked with them, and this reinforced my interests, my approach. And then I finally ended up in the US. I moved, I think, was it 26 years ago? I was in Chicago at first for a few years, and then I came to Stanford more than 20 years ago. And my own approach really had been shaped by my original interests and then had expanded over time in Cambridge. And then when I got to Stanford, I probably foolishly insisted on studying things you couldn't just study by just looking at ancient evidence. I started with agrarian history, where you needed to have an understanding of how agrarian societies more generally worked, better attested ones, which was similar but better documented. Then I moved into demography, which is a really bad idea because there's very little data for ancient population studies. So you have to look at other pre-modern populations to make any sense of what happened in antiquity. And then when I arrived at Stanford around 2002 or 3, I figured, well, Pacific Rim, this was the time when China was seemingly beginning to open up and was opening up. And the hopes were it was going to be an open-ended process, right? And we could really have collaborations and really bring the study of early China into the fold of ancient history. So along with some colleagues, we organized workshops and conferences and edited volumes. And I did this for a number of years. And as you all know, it didn't quite work out that way for political reasons. But in the meantime, I had become more interested in even bigger issues like world history. They were really entirely question driven. Like, are there overarching dynamics in the evolution of economic inequality from the Stone Age all the way to the present? And it turns out, yes, but you have to really look at the very broad sweep of history to figure this out. I was very interested in the question of the Great Divergence. Why do Western countries pull ahead of others over the last couple of centuries? How deep are the roots of that process? And of course, being an ancient historian, the professional occupational hazard was to seek those roots in antiquity. So I wrote a big book on that too. So I've been traveling along that trajectory for really quite a long time, for a number of decades. And I was very lucky to end up at Stanford because what I found was a group of like-minded colleagues. You have referenced Ian Morris, who came a few years before I did, on the Greek history side of things, who was very interested in quantification and use of models, and so on. Josiah Ober joined us a few years later in the political science department, who I don't know if people include him in the Stanford School or not, but I think should be. He works on Greek democracy, but again, from a poli-sci perspective, right? With theoretical approaches that come out of political science and simulations, and so on. And Richard Seller joined us later as our school dean, but he had long been instrumental as well. What many of these people had in common, Ian and Richard and I, was the Cambridge background. So we had already a shared experience in some ways. They had been students, I had been a postdoc, and we tried to really sort of, I don't know, upgrade is a very bold term, but you're trying to upgrade that particular approach for the 21st century. And I think in as much as there's a Stanford School, and we didn't come up with the term. I have no idea who coined the term. I guess you could do a search somehow and find out who first used it. I have no idea. But in as much as there's a Stanford School, it's really that we share certain premises in a way, that we're all interested in, I think, development, very broadly defined, and various aspects of human flourishing, whether it's economic growth or physical well-being or, political freedom, for want of a better word, various, expressions or dimensions of human flourishing. And the belief or the conviction that you can't understand those things for the ancient world unless you are explicitly comparative. You go out and look at many other societies. You apply theoretical approaches with a lowercase t, not a capital T grand theory kind of thing, but theoretical approaches that you create models, verbal models, not the fancy quantitative models that dominate econ and to some extent poli-sci at this point, but verbal models. And that you have to do all these things in order to really get to a better understanding of the overarching dynamics of change, shall we say, in the ancient world. And then defining the ancient world more broadly than usual was a bit of a side effect. But originally, we were all pretty much focused on on being able to better understand Greece or Rome by maybe drawing in information from elsewhere. But the primary goal used to be to understand Greece and Rome better. And I think more recently we have sort of branched out beyond that. And now we are more interested in world history more generally for its own sake, not as something that enriches our understanding of Greece and Rome, but something that's worth studying in its own right. So that would be my very brief summary of what I think the Stanford School is about.
And what do you think that favored the emergence of this dynamic, innovative, intellectual environment? And I'm curious about this again for personal reasons, but also, I mean, it's in the background of a theme of the book, right? So how do you manage to consolidate spaces where collectively people can generate interesting ideas and move towards something that it's useful for the broader society? What do you think happened at Stanford? Was it that you were so far away from Rome and Greece that help a bit, being the West Coast? What's the story there like?
I don't think that. I think that's part of the story, right? I mean, the closer you are to the locations of heritage, so to speak, the more you are, in a way, in thrall of the evidence as such. It's certainly the case in continental Europe. There's even a big difference between what goes on at the Ivy League, let's say, or East Coast institutions, and what goes on in California. So distance does actually matter. Newness. Berkeley, Stanford are not really that old, comparatively speaking. Stanford in particular is always happy to let people do their own thing, so to speak, right? And maybe not respect established boundaries all that much. But I think the single most important contribution was just at the personal level, that you need to jumpstart the whole thing, which happened when if you want the whole genealogy, when Richard Saller in Chicago hired Ian Morris to come to Chicago, and then Ian Morris came to Stanford and he hired me, and then somehow Richard Saller joined us later on for different reasons. And so things came together not entirely coincidentally because there was some management behind it, but the outcome was by no means a given. And some additions like Joshua leaving Princeton to come here, we had not that much to do with. I mean, things had to come together in just the right way. That included a great deal of serendipity. But then all of a sudden, you have a sizable number of people who all sort of share those interests and concerns and methodological approaches. And all of a sudden, you have something to work with because then it's easier to recruit graduate students of a certain kind. And that's what we have been doing for the last 20 plus years. And of course, forever being the pessimist, because I'm, after all, from Vienna, it's not going to last forever, right? I mean, this group will eventually gradually fade from view, just like the Cambridge School actually has. There was a really big deal back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and it's completely gone. So the same is going to happen to the Stanford School. All we can hope is that it gives some kind of longer lasting impulses to, others that come after us.
Let's jump into the book, and I think we're gonna circle back on this question, but let's start with the way in which you try to frame the big picture message, right? So, and you begin suggesting that there are two big ways of thinking about ancient history, and one is the popular way, right? And you've used Wikipedia as a proxy of that, right? Let's start with that. So what's that general popular way of thinking about ancient history, and then we can get into what's the scholar approach and what are the issues with that approach?
Well, let me tell you, the really popular approach is to say, that's ancient history, right? I mean, that's how people use the term ordinarily. Most sort of regular people, when they talk about ancient history, they think that it's sort of a way of saying something is really a long time ago. It's no longer relevant, it's obsolete. And I think it colors the general understanding of ancient history, which I think is really important because before the 19th century, if you called something ancient, it was a term of veneration, right? Of respect. And then in the early 19th century, people came up with this phrase, that's ancient history, to put something down, right? To denigrate something as irrelevant because modernization accelerated and people changed their mind about things. So that's the real popular understanding. And in as much as there is a more sort of scholarly understanding out there, it's probably mostly Greeks and Romans. It may be whatever appears on Ancient Aliens, right? On various cable channels. So it's not particularly well defined. Wikipedia is actually, Wikipedia says ancient history is the history of the whole world from 3000 BC to 500 AD, which is on the one hand very ambitious because it takes a planetary kind of approach. And it's at the same time imposes chronological boundaries that basically make no sense outside very tiny slivers of that world. So if anybody looked that up, they couldn't really figure out why ancient history is configured this particular way. But I think it's fair to say, especially in Western countries, that when you talk about ancient history, people think primarily about Greece and Rome, and maybe secondarily about things like Egyptians building pyramids and Old Testament Hebrews, and that sort of thing, and far less about early China, early India, and hardly ever, I think, about the pre-Hispanic Americas, for instance, or sub-Saharan Africa. So there's generally a very narrow conception of what antiquity is or ancient history is out there, not just among the general public, but also, and one might say especially, among academics. I mean, getting to the professional definition, if you just look at actual usage, at revealed preference, right, what people actually do, people may say all kinds of things, but if you look at what they actually do, then for the most part, when people use in academia, use the term ancient history, what they mean is just Greece and Rome. There are journals of ancient history and ancient histories and associations of ancient historians, and they're really just for people who study Greece and Rome. Or if you're lucky, it's what I like to call Greece and Rome plus, where you study the ancient Mediterranean plus its immediate neighbors of societies that are close in space and time, like in North Africa or West Asia, but it's as far as it goes. And you only really study them because they have some connection to the Greeks and Romans. So they're like second-class citizens, but they're brought in order to flesh out the story of Greece and Rome. And that's been going on for a really long time. It's been going on for more than 200 years in pretty much all European countries that I'm aware of. That seems to be a problem because if you use the term without any qualifier attached, it implies that there's only a tiny sliver of the world that had some kind of history in antiquity. Everybody else, I don't know, doesn't count or had something else that doesn't qualify as proper ancient history. It's all implied. It's never spelled out, but the implications are not very appealing.
And before talking about those issues, why do you think that this emphasis on Greece and Rome has been so persistent? What's the force behind the endurance of the interest in Romans and Greeks?
Well, it's fair to say that people in Europe, when you talk about the Western tradition here, and in China, when people talk about antiquity, they mean, the Warring States period. I mean, Confucius lived and that sort of thing. But if you think talk about the Western tradition, it's really Europeans have always been interested in Greece and Rome because those are the ancient societies they knew something about because of various continuities and transmission of text and art and monuments and so on. So it's not surprising that people in modern Europe paid special attention to Greece and Rome. That's inevitable. But what we do see over time is that sort of up to about 1800, when people try to talk about antiquity, they try to talk about everything that was known. And there were huge imbalances. 90% was about Greece and Rome, but people did their best. They were actively interested in other ancient societies to the extent that they were knowable at the time. And paradoxically, as our knowledge of other ancient societies started to grow after 1800 because of the decipherment of hieroglyphs and cuneiform and archaeology and the Jesuits going to China and translating texts and Sanskrit texts being translated in India and any number of things happening around that time, all of a sudden, ancient history doesn't broaden to keep up with this. It actually becomes narrower than it was before. And people start saying it's only Greece and Rome, and everything else doesn't really belong into the domain of ancient history proper. So that's a bit of a paradox. And once that was put in place, and you had programs devoted entirely to the study of Greece and Rome with their own degrees and a great reputation at the time, what took over is essentially institutional inertia. And while we are both in academia, we know what academia is like. Nobody has ever lost any money betting against academic inertia of academic institutions. Once something is in place, unless there is a major paradigm shift, it will remain in place forever. And you can really see this. You can trace this over time, 19th century, 20th century, up into the 21st century at this point. That's the way it has been. When history becomes a field in its own right, which is later, so the study of Greece and Rome is constituted first as a separate field, and then history becomes like an academic discipline with its own departments and degrees and programs and so on. Well, what do they get to cover? They cover history minus Greece and Rome, because Greece and Rome are already spoken for. And then you also eliminate all the pre-colonial people in other parts of the world because they're not really part of proper Western style history. And again, for any number of reasons having to do with, outright denigration of those people, where you look at them and say, they don't have a real history. Nothing ever changes, or they're not even fully human, right? In some cases, right? They are sort of vaguely subhuman, they're just barbarians, they're savages and so on. They can't have their own proper history. And while we no longer subscribe, I hope, to any of those toxic notions, the frameworks, the templates put in place at the time are still with us. They have not changed. They were never actually modified, even as our attitudes and our knowledge has changed dramatically. So we are stuck in those cages. It was set up 200 plus years ago because, well, they are self-perpetuating, right? I mean, academics hire the next generation of academics and they follow established templates. And there has been no major paradigm shift. Unlike in other fields, right? I mean, in certain other fields, in STEM fields, you maybe couldn't do things the way you did them 200 years ago because it no longer makes any sense. That has not happened in the humanities more generally, right? There are fields with us that have been around for a long time. And whenever you try to expand, you just keep the old and you superimpose new stuff on top, right? All the programs that are called something studies, they don't replace what came before, they just edit on in addition. But all the real power in terms of hiring and credentialing and so on still lie with the old established disciplines. And they go back 200 years, and if they no longer make any sense, nobody really seems to care. Because for reasons of convention and convenience, we just carry on as before. We try to do our own thing. within the constraints of those frameworks. But the frameworks really reassert their power every single day. And they really make it impossible to break out of these cages that were erected for very, very different reasons nobody's really happy with anymore. But somehow they're still with us.
I want to ask you in a bit more about how this shift in paradigm would look like. But for doing that, I guess at first would be probably helpful to have a better sense of how you understand the ancient era, right? And you suggest that it's a period, and so your term is world making, right? And you describe there are these important innovations that many of them take place independently. What are those innovations, and how do you think about, how do you define this ancient period that it's supposed, well, you prefer not talk about it as a period but as a phase, right? But how is this phase then characterized, and what are those key features and innovations that you consider essential to recognize?
Yeah, I think the best way to capture the significance of antiquity is to define it as a foundational period. And of course, people have always done that. They just figured, well, whatever the Greeks and Romans came up with was foundational to later Western civilization. I would define it much more broadly. I think we need to really take several steps back and look at the whole world and ask ourselves, is there some kind of transition process going on that we can see that really creates the earliest version of the world that we currently inhabit? And the answer is yes. For most of the world, there is such a process, which happens in the Holocene. There are many changes before that, right, that are really important, like people walking on two legs and having bigger brains and more things, but that just sort of makes them human. It doesn't create a recognizable version of the world that we currently inhabit. The first recognizably similar version of our world comes into existence at different times in different places when people embrace food production, in particular farming, herding, sedentism, sometimes not sedentism, if a pastoralist, doesn't really matter. Any number of things, all the physical infrastructure that we have. I look at you and I can see a chair and a table and walls and a window and any number of things. And none of those things existed before. They actually come into existence at broadly the same time, right? For, interrelated reasons, mining, metallurgy, all the physical things that surround us are really spruced up versions of things that people start using for the first time and putting together into whole packages of infrastructure, very broadly defined, for the first time a few thousand years ago. And we still use the same package. It's just a much nicer package, but it's still the same package. The same is true of social arrangements, right? There is a period where the current political forms come into existence for the first time, where you have autocracies and monarchies and democracies and oligarchies and all these various things. They didn't always exist. They actually created for the first time. When urbanism is created for the first time, village life first, and then the city. And once you have a city, you have the countryside. Before that, everything is essentially the same. You have class structures. You have organized warfare. You have any number of things that really govern our existence in really fundamental ways that did not exist in a recognizably similar way before, but they were created as innovations and increasingly bundled together into a package that turned out to be very, very competitive, and so crowded out alternative lifeways. Just as foraging was crowded out by the farmers, alternative social arrangements are gradually crowded out by this dominant package. Literacy is part of the package, obviously, in terms of record keeping, literature. You can't have advanced mathematics without literature, without literacy. So all these things are logically interconnected, and all the major belief systems that are still dominant numerically in the world today come into existence near the sort of later phases of that particular process in different parts of the world. The major world religions, the major philosophical systems, whether it's in the West, whether it's in China. And so at some point, all these things are there. And then what happens over the next couple of thousand years is they just sort of evolve in a way. And there's a big acceleration, of course, in recent centuries. But everything is directly rooted in those bundled together innovations that show up at a particular stage of development. And I think if ancient historians want to do themselves a favor, this is how they should define ancient history. A, get rid of the name ancient, which no longer carries any clout, and embrace something like foundational, transformative, something to really bring out the significance of these interlinked processes, but not just for PR reasons. It's because it actually really mattered. It did literally make our world, the earliest version of our world. And if you're interested in why things are the way they are, we can't really hope to understand this unless we go back to the creation of that package. So that's my expansive view of how we should ideally define ancient history, and then try to figure out how to put this into practice, right? How to approach this in teaching and research.
So let's try to open up that proposal, right, of how to things, how to change things. And for that, and you already mentioned some of this, but this might be important for some of our audience, of the audience we have, which is to contextualize again what classics departments are, right, and the relationship with history. I come from Latin America, and in Latin America, you really don't have classics as such. I don't know if this is the case in like the entire Hispanic tradition. Um, but it's certainly essential in your story and the way in which you think that, at least in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, things should change. So help us understanding that, and then let's get into, well, okay, so what do we do with these classic departments, and what are your solutions for the problems there?
So once upon a time, as I said, when people tried to study antiquity, they tried to study everything. And then the sort of narrowing down occurred. It occurred first, as far as we can tell, at German universities, which were the pioneers in setting up the modern academic system, for good or ill. So around 250 years ago, some people had the idea is we have to create, the Greeks and Romans are so special for any number of reasons I don't want to bore you with, but they were considered to be even more special than before. It was a bit of a backlash against modernity. It was tied up with having to have some kind of proper origin story for Europeans who were increasingly globally dominant, right? They had to tell themselves a story about why that was, and the Greeks in particular played a major role in that. So there are any number of reasons for why people had this idea. And the idea was Greeks and Romans are so special that they deserve their own field. We have to have a field that studies everything related to Greece and Rome. The language, the literature, the history, the material culture, the philosophy, the arts, any rusty nail that is ancient, Greek or Roman, deserves to be studied because the amazing Greeks and Romans made it. I exaggerate very, very slightly in this case. So you end up with the idea, they didn't call it classics, they called it Altertumswissenschaft, the science of antiquity. But then you see similar developments in Britain in the course of the 19th century, where people say, let's not just do philology, let's just do, language and literature and linguistics. Let's do the whole thing that the Germans do. There's an enormous amount of imitation of what the Germans do in this period, in France, in Italy, in Spain, in Scandinavia, in the Netherlands, and eventually in the US, and then various offshoots as well. And so the whole by 1900, this concept has really swept the Western world, broadly defined. The idea being there is a separate way of engaging with Greece and Rome, a holistic way, where you have to sort of understand ideally everything to make sense of any one part, which was very sort of notional even to begin with, because specialization kicks in very early on, but at least the illusion was being, or delusion was being upheld. This was, if not possible, then at least the ideal that should be adhered to. And for whatever reason, and that, again, I should say, it still needs to be really fully, properly studied, this particular template continued to not just exist, but be dominant in the UK and in the former British colonies, to some extent, including the United States, whereas in continental Europe, again, following the lead of Germany, it sort of went out of fashion. Because at some point, universities in Germany lose interest in this, and they say, well, we are now so specialized. We have separate programs for just Greek and Latin, and we have separate programs. We have ancient historians who work in history departments, and we have archaeologists who work in archaeology departments, and the whole classics template just falls apart. And for whatever reason, in the UK and its offshoots, it never really has. And what you get in the US is a hybrid, because some institutions are influenced by the UK model and some are influenced by the German continental European model. And so you have both models side by side. But it's probably about, I don't know, I haven't counted them, but it's probably about 50-50. So classics is still quite popular, but it's not as dominant as it is in the UK. I think this is very important because it shows there is no one quote unquote correct way of studying Greece and Rome. We have now established for generations that there are different ways of doing this, and they all work. So the argument you always often hear, if we got rid of the classics template and reconfigure the study, even just of Greece and Rome, everything would go downhill. People would stop studying, Greek and Latin and the Greeks and the Romans and so on. And that's just manifestly untrue, because vast numbers of people have been doing this now for generations in other parts of the world. But for whatever reason, the perspectives are so parochial that people just don't like to think about it. So there's an almost emotional attachment at this point between the idea of classics as a quintessentially Greco-Roman holistic field and the survival of our engagement with those particular cultures. So that's one problem. There are others in terms of what I just said a few minutes ago, right? If you're interested in studying ancient history as a potentially global kind of process or phase of development, what makes the Greeks and Romans so special? Maybe they are special. Maybe they make some really amazing contributions, are unique in some ways. But how would you know, right? They have to be fully contextualized. They have to be fully embedded in a planet-wide study of the ancient world, more broadly defined. And the moment you do that, you will have to ask yourself, what's the point of having a separate classics department, a separate classics program? Of course, you have to study the Greeks and Romans. They are exceptionally well documented, especially deeply researched. There are lots of existing resources. They will play a major role in any kind of study of the ancient world. But why does it have to be within the context of classics? It's just no longer obvious why that should be the case.
Okay, and how? So I have a bunch of questions here, but let's start probably with the global part of this. And one of the things that I was trying to reflect upon while going through the book was, okay, why do we need to have a global perspective in every department, which is more or less what you seem to suggest? Why wouldn't be a solution like a set of different nationalistic or regional views of history, right? In which, well, in continental Europe, they focus on the Franks and, well, the Germans more generally understood, and in Latin America, about the Mesoamerican civilizations. Wouldn't that be a solution to this concern that you have? What are the pros and cons of that approach in your view?
It would be a solution in theory if they all talk to each other. In practice, they don't. So it's not actually, I think, empirically feasible to get to that kind of perspective that we would need to have in order to understand what actually happened in that phase of development without doing something about the established templates and boundaries. Now, I necessarily put out a maximalist message because it's meant as a manifesto. And I do say near the end, it may not be feasible for all institutions to adopt this. It is highly feasible at well-resourced institutions because they already have programs that study different parts of the ancient world, and all you have to do is essentially consolidate them. And you can do this at no extra cost. You just make sure that people who study structurally similar phenomena in different parts of the world do it together in order to improve the understanding both of their own cases and of the overarching processes. That could very easily be done. Now, of course, in many places, there are just not enough resources, not enough people. It's never going to happen. So in that case, at the very least, we should work to instill some kind of awareness of this broader framework. And I swear I'm not exaggerating. You can talk to hyper-specialized people who've spent their entire academic career just looking at one tiny sliver of material in one particular part of the world. And that's all they're ever going to look at, right? They are always going to just focus on this without not being ignorant. They know there are other things out there, but without seeing any need to engage with those things, even at the most superficial level, which I believe is a very serious problem. It's a very serious problem because, and I would take a pretty radical position on this, I don't think it's possible to understand even your own case, so to speak. So you're a specialist, specialize in a particular ancient society. You know everything there is to know about this. You know all the ancient evidence, you know all the modern scholarship, which is impossible anyway, but just assume for the sake of argument you will still not really understand what's going on. You will never fully understand, of course, that's inevitable. But the moment you read your first book about some other culture, it's going to produce a much bigger benefit than reading your 500th book about your own culture, so to speak, right? Because this will generate ideas. It's going to give you inspirations, impulses. It's going to cause you to question certain assumptions that are deeply entrenched in your own subspecialism because nobody ever thinks about alternatives. And you think, well, wait a minute, maybe it was more like this and so on. So there are any number of ways where even superficial comparative history or cross-cultural history would help you break out of those shells, out of those mini cages. And that in turn would improve your ability to study your own case. You don't have to be interested in explaining world history. Very few people are, and that's fine, right? Everybody will need to start out as a specialist. I think that's inevitable. But once you're a specialist, it doesn't mean you always have to be just a specialist, right? And some people will move more away from this and others less so. But I think we need to create incentive structures, if you will, that positively encourage branching out and the broadening, whereas the incentive structures that are currently in place actively work against this. They reward people for not doing that, for sticking to what they know best and not being led astray by any kind of more global considerations. Again, I exaggerate, but I exaggerate only to some extent.
And how do we do this in practical terms? So how's your view on this, right? If they give you all the power here at the university, how would you start your revolution? Do you close down the classics department, you move all the faculty to history, and then you start to find ways of hiring new people? Like, how would the field should be, like the incentives that would be structured around the faculty, the programs that should be offered to students? How have you envisioned that transformation?
Well, as I say, it's not just a fantasy because these things are actually happening just for the wrong reasons. So if you look at public institutions in the US, whenever they run into a fiscal, pressure situation, some provost comes along or some dean and says, we're going to consolidate departments. And all of a sudden, there is no longer a classics department. There's a department of world languages and world literatures and a department of history and religious studies and then some and so on. So this is already happening, right? But it's happening at the barrel of a budgetary gun, if I like to say, not for intellectual reasons. And it would be nice if we were a little more proactive about this and say, well, maybe there are better reasons for why we should do this. But it's already happening, right? It's not a counterfactual. It's already happening on the ground anyway. It's just in ways that make people unhappy. So how would you do it? As I said, if you are in well-resourced institutions, very little may need to happen, right? You just consolidate existing specialisms and then make sure that in terms of training, you strike more of a balance between sort of grooming future experts and also equipping people with what they need in order to engage with other cases and operate in a more sort of globalized intellectual environment. So change would have to come at very different levels. It's not just changing the sign on a building. It's about training, right? Teaching, undergraduate teaching. That's where the most progress has occurred anyway, because there are always big survey classes and there's demand for them. At the graduate level, change is much more difficult to implement, I think, because there's always the tendency to we can't really give up anything we've been doing so far. And if we need to add something, we just add it, but you can't just keep adding because that's not feasible either. So some trade-offs would need to be made at that level, at least to change conditions and expectations and incentives for the next generations. Then you run into the barrier of hiring, right? You can train people a certain way, and then hiring departments want something more conventional. So what are you going to do about this? So there are many moving parts. So it's in practice very difficult to get the process started, even if you had a perfect blueprint, which I don't claim to have, right? I want to motivate people to think harder about this and productively about it and really have a big debate. One person can't figure out what should ideally happen. But even if we had a perfect blueprint, it would be difficult to set everything in motion because all the different parts are interconnected in certain ways that create multiple obstacles. So on the one hand, I truly think that we would benefit from this, and it's perfectly feasible in principle. In practical terms, I'm considerably less optimistic because it's difficult to see a clear pathway of actually doing all these things. One option would be for the best resourced institutions in a way to um, act as sort of as models in a way and saying, look, we are going to do this. And there's often a trend to then follow suit, whatever comes out of a particular slice of the higher education system tends to be emulated by others. But of course, the best resourced institutions have the least incentive to do that because they're under the least financial pressure. And they're happy with the way things are because it worked really well for them. And even more importantly, faculty, the current faculty in whatever program, well, they are selected for certain attributes, one of which is they did really well in the existing system. They wouldn't be faculty if they hadn't done well in terms of the way things are. So their incentive for change is not very large, to put it mildly, right? They are the ones who are actually happiest with the current situation. They may not fully believe in it intellectually, but effectively they've been doing well out of it. So why would there be any concerted action for change coming out of those constituencies? So it's actually really, difficult in practice to launch this kind of reform process.
And so, considering all these challenges, right? So the veto role of incumbents, the lack of financial constraints by many institutions, well, the general inertia of academia. What's your forecast of the situation, right? So I mean that a lot of the book is like your desire of how things should play out. What's your actual perspective? How do you think that ancient history, what do you think that if we have this conversation again in 20, 50 years about ancient history, how do you think that the conversation would follow, right? How would they define it, and would we be having a similar type of theme about Greeks and Romans at the core, classic departments, and the crisis? How do you foresee this unfolding?
Well, I think different outcomes I could at least think of. One, of course, the most pessimistic one is to say there won't be a discussion because nobody's going to study ancient history anymore anyway. And it's all been taken over by AI or I don't know what. So that's the most pessimistic outcome. That's almost certainly not going to happen because at the richest institutions, chairs and entire departments are more or less endowed. So unless the economy not just tanks but collapses, that is just going to continue, just like monasteries, tend to continue in the very long term. So at some level, there probably will still be people like me at institutions like ours having this kind of conversation even 50 years from now. There's another possible outcome that I'd rather not think about, which is that if we follow certain trajectories that are visible right now, in terms of increasing nationalism, if you think of the regime in China, developments in India, and developments in the United States, for that matter, if you sort of continued those trends and imagine that they would become stronger over time, we might end up with a situation where, sure, there is an ancient history, but it will have been repurposed for for political purposes in a way, to shore up certain narratives about why one civilizational lineage is better than the other and so on. I can quite easily imagine such an outcome in the longer term. I don't think it's desirable, but we can't completely rule it out. And then the optimistic version is that there's some version of what I've been talking about might eventually happen for a number of reasons, partly, as I said, consolidation driven by financial issues, the loss of legitimacy of established arrangements in the context of a broader crisis of academia and especially the academic humanities, which are under, I think, very serious pressure from AI and related developments in ways people prefer not to really think too deeply about, but it's already beginning to happen. So it may well be that this kind of shock triggers a paradigm shift that might move everything more in a direction that I have in mind, coupled with the awareness, and I think that's not irrelevant, that at the end of the day, well, there's only one human species and we inhabit a world that is way more globalized than it has ever been. And how do you do justice to that, right? Do you do justice to that by just doubling down on your own niche and your own lineage and your own special bits and pieces? Or are you trying to really gain a more planetary understanding that might then help us address planet scale problems to do with the environment or any number of other issues? Or do we want to fall back on the old sort of more nationalistic or regional kinds of narratives? And I think both outcomes are possible, but there is at least some hope that we might shift more in the direction of what I have outlined here. But jury is certainly out. So I wouldn't venture a prediction of which of these outcomes is more likely in the next 20 or 30 or 50 years.
And let me ask you a final question, which is probably the same one that I just asked you, but from a personal point of view. How do you talk about this with your graduate students and well, even undergraduates who like the idea both of getting into the classics system or aiming to be someone like you, a proper global ancient historian, right? So how do you reconcile this uncertainty that you seem to be quite aware of and not constraining the spirit of someone that could potentially do a lot of good trying to aim for this good aims that you recognize as useful, right? So what are these conversations? How do they look like, and what type of advice could you give to someone who's listening that it's in that position?
Well, I mean, the most fundamental advice is don't do it, right? I mean, don't don't join a PhD program in the academic humanities because there are no jobs. And, if you want to do it anyway, you have to be either super committed, you have to be absolutely sure this is what you want to do, or you have to be independently wealthy, which always helps in a number of situations. And you have to be fully prepared that while you may enjoy those 6 years you spend in the program, it may not lead to an academic position. And be aware of that. And I don't see this necessarily as a very large problem. I mean, it's easy for me to say, right? A tenured faculty member, but in a way, you could say, well, having that experience is of value in and of itself, and it doesn't necessarily lead to academic employment as long as you have a plan B, so to speak. Now, apart from that, more specifically about classics, ancient history, it's hard to say because the students that going back to the question of the Stanford School, right? The people who apply or the ones that we consider to be competitive are the ones who already gravitate in that direction anyway. So there are no hard conversations to be had in a way because people join us in order to do ancient history, ancient studies a certain way. And I have to say, that's also a cause for moderate optimism. They've been doing pretty well, even in a overall more conservative system, because the system is at the same time conservative and always on the lookout for something new. It shouldn't be too new, right? It should still be possible to accommodate it within the existing framework, but it shouldn't be just exactly more of the same. And so I think we have been, occupying that niche quite successfully. As long as students are aware of the constraints that will be put on them in terms of what we need to require to hand out a classics degree. If we could call it something else, certain requirements would fall by the wayside, being able to teach Greek or Latin at all levels. That's not necessary. if you want to be a world historian. It may still be necessary to know the languages, but not to be able to teach them and so on. So there are certain requirements we are to tie our hands to some extent. But you also have to be aware that future employers, if they actually enter academia, may have similarly conservative expectations, and that they need to be able to meet them, even if they're interested in a different way of doing things. And ideally, they should be able to do both. So it's really a bit of a tightrope walk, right? I mean, you you don't want to give in to conservative inertia, if you will, but you can't push too far the other way either, because you're going to produce students who may not be employable even at the best of times, and we are certainly not in the best of times. So, and beyond that, it's really hard to know what advice to give to anyone, given very, very recent developments in terms of information processing. Maybe everything we are talking about right now will be proverbial ancient history, just a few years from now.
Walter, thanks a lot. This was a lovely conversation. Fantastic and weirdly introspective view of this. So thanks a lot.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Economic and Political History Podcast. Don't forget to stay connected with us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Javier Mejia C and connect with me on LinkedIn. You can find me as Javier Mejia Cubillos. Until next time, stay engaged. Thank you and take care.